This is the European edition of Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show. We bring you the European unicorns, startups, founders, regulators, and leaders innovating the rapidly evolving fintech scene today. A truly localized podcast with both English and local language content, with some of the world's most well-known hosts and influencers in the fintech sector globally. Join us every week as we explore what makes the European Union a phenomenal proving ground for many of the fastest growing fintech plays in the world today. Okay, let's roll.
Welcome to Breaking Banks Europe, the #1 global fintech radio network. This is episode 237, where we'll be speaking about fintech for good, specifically how banks and startups are working together to improve the lives of farmers. My name is Elizabeth Kleinfeld, and today I have Trevor Sieck of Rabobank's FoodBytes and Jake Joraanstad, the CEO and founder of Bushel. Before we get started, could you all please introduce yourselves a little bit more than this? And we'll start with you, Trevor.
Yeah, thanks, Liz, and thanks for having me today. So I work within the FoodBytes pillar of Rabobank. Rabobank is the world's largest bank servicing the food and agriculture sector. And what my team does is look at the innovations that are providing meaningful evolutions to our clients, as well as the bank itself.
Thank you.
Jake here. I'm the CEO of Bushel. What I do is we build software for agriculture. We work largely with grain companies and ag retailers across the U.S. and Canada. So think about those companies who buy grain from the farmer or might sell them seed, chemical, or fertilizer. They're our customer.
So your customers, like the co-ops?
That's right. A co-op is a great example. Maybe an ethanol plant or a mill. They buy our software and then they use it to reach their farmers in a digital way so they can interact, help them to sell their grain, maybe sell them fertilizer, et cetera. Super.
Thank you. So, at the end of the day, when I was speaking to Trevor, I asked him, of all the startups, which one would you invite? And he decided to invite you. So I'm kind of curious, Trevor, why do you want to invite Jake? Now that I've had a conversation with him earlier, I have lots of ideas, but I want to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I think there's a good tie-in here with the fintech angle. I think Jake can speak more clearly to that. But what we are excited about, Jake, is his ability and his company's capability to break through not only on a technological level for his end users on the farmer and grower side, but also on the client side. That's one part of it. The other part, I think, is somehow cultural. And so the breakthrough there is communicating with a set of users that are somewhat challenging and are not resistant to change, but they're going to have a measured approach to adoption. And so that's what we're really excited about. And I think, again, he can speak clearly to that.
Well, definitely some of the numbers you shared with me earlier speak to the ability to get this population to adopt. So yeah, Jake, tell us a little bit about the problem you're solving and then why you're specifically the one to solve that problem.
Yeah, so for starters, the realization that my co-founder Ryan and I had was agriculture, particularly the supply chain, what we sometimes call the messy middle, what was really lacking on digitization, and the idea that a farmer might deliver their grain to a local co-op and have to keep track of everything on paper. This was back in 2016. We had this kind of realization. It was like there seems to be a better way to do that. And so we began the path of how do we make that interaction between the farmer and their delivery point at the co-op more digital. And then from there, we realized that there was all kinds of challenges. There was just knowing what you've sold for your grain so far, even simply what the price might be that you've made a commitment to, and maybe when that delivery is going to be. And so we began working on all these challenges, and we both realized that because we were in the Midwest, we grew up around farm families. In the case of Ryan, my co-founder, he still works on the farm today, his family farm. That changed. That gave us an opportunity to say, hey, we think we could be the guys to work on this problem and focus on agriculture. And so we dove in, and today we serve about 3,600 facilities in the U.S. and Canada, and we reach about 100,000 farms a month that use our software.
100,000 farms. So that sounds like a huge number of farms. How many farms are there actually out there in the US?
I think if you ask various folks, you probably hear different answers. But in the U.S., somewhere between a few 100,000, couple 100,000 farms that are sort of large enough and meaningful to maybe 1 million is kind of on the high end that you might argue for the number of farms or farmers out there. And maybe Trevor has a different answer, but that's generally the agreed upon range of farms in the U.S. that kind of are big enough to be considered a farm business.
What other thing you had mentioned yesterday is that you've got like 22, if I understood this correctly, billion bushels in the USA, and of those, that your customer base would reflect over half of that. So that's another way to look at this. That's huge.
So we think about row crops in the U.S., your corn and your soybeans, maybe your wheat and barley and all of those kind of crops rolled up is 22, 23 billion bushels a year, sometimes plus or minus. And we typically, on an annual basis, our customers represent over half of that today. So that's kind of the reach that we have with our tools. And we don't do every part of the process, but we are really involved between the farmer and the facility and how they do business together.
So for a moment, I want to look at the fintech for good angle, right? The angle of what is it that, in terms of transactions, that you're able to help them with now, and what do you have for the future that you're looking forward to? So, like now, are you able to help them in managing loans that they may have, and what does that look like?
Yeah, so what we realized as we were digging into this problem was almost everything in agriculture is a paper check today. So in the US, it's probably a foreign concept if you're not from here, but the paper check is still a large part of how money moves. Over 80% of payments to a farmer are on a paper check, if you believe it. And
I do believe it in the US, yeah.
And something similar when it comes to farmers paying their bills. And the reason is these transactions are large. And so a $20,000 fertilizer bill isn't it's not generally helpful to put that on a credit card for a few reasons, but one of them is just the cost structure doesn't make sense. And then for a farmer to get paid today, they have to get a check in the mail, and then they have to drive that check to the bank, which happens to not be in their backyard because they're on a farm. So they've got to go to town, and they've got to get sometimes a second person to sign that check because they've got to lien against their grain assets on that account first, and then they can deposit it. And so we realized that the money movement of agriculture was lacking, and that and access to capital, although it's access to capital in the U.S. is largely doable for a farm, it's not accessible as it needs to be. And from a technology standpoint, it's very backwards. And so our approach was, how could we sit in that part of the problem and work on making that easier? And so we've built out a technology platform that allows electronic payments to and from the farmer, uses the ACH rather than credit cards or paper checks. And it makes it a lot easier for farmers to simply click a couple buttons, and now they're paying a $20,000 fertilizer bill or getting paid for their grain.
Amazing. Now, Trevor, now I know why you wanted Jake to be the one to come on this session. This seems like a huge benefit to these farmers. Is there something else you'd like to add to what Jake's been saying, what you've seen?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we can reduce that down, right? Like, again, it could be a cultural position that you look view that you look at this, but is it adding immediate grower value? Is it accessible to that same grower and farmer user, and is it affordable? So these are kind of need to haves that we see throughout the value chain for technologies that are going to be onboarded. So technologies like Bushel that are expanding to provide, auxiliary technological improvements to operations that go beyond fintech is where we see the most excitement. The mature companies that can compound technologies to add value to that same grower set is where we see a real interesting point of inflection. And having the trust at an early stage is how you're going to bring those customers along with you on that journey.
That makes sense. Thank you for reiterating that. So,
no problem.
There were two other things that when I spoke to Jake, I found very interesting. And forgive me if there are a lot more, but then Trevor, you might want to add to it. So one of them, Jake, was you told me about how if, for some reason with all these forest fires we're having, floods, the climate change aspects, that what we see is it's, hard for the farmers to be able to put in their claims, but you have a way that makes it a lot easier. Could you talk to that?
Yeah. So traditionally, if you have you typically have crop insurance in the U.S., and if you have a problem where you've got to file a claim, you'd be digging up these paper tickets to prove what you've delivered to the elevator and prove what you actually grew for a crop. And that can be really not a fun process, or you've got to go in and get something printed out and signed off on. And of course, since we work with those co-ops, it makes it easier for us to be able to just help the farmers self-serve that information. And so they can go into their Bushel powered product from that co-op, and they can do a what we call a proof of yield report on their own. And then now they've got the proof that they need to file that claim. They've got they use it every year to file for other reasons as well. And so the idea of self-service and giving the farmer the ability to be on their phone or on their computer and just do the work that they need to do is what we focus on at Bushel. We think about it as like how do we automate or make the workflow between the farm and the facility much easier, and that's just one example.
Well, that's a great example. And one of the other ones when you were talking about, well, if a farmer does have a loan, and typically I think you were saying that they use that loan in the first half of the year. You help them to manage that by linking to the bank where they have the loan. But you also are going to be able to offer them different options. Might they need loans in the future as of next year? You want to tell us about that?
Yeah. So our customer, the co-op, he typically has various forms of financing programs they can offer a farmer. So they might have one that's from their manufacturer that they sell inputs from. So let's say it's a fertilizer or a seed or a chemical. They'll have some sort of program there to finance those inputs. And then at the same time, those farmers might also be working with Rabobank or a farm credit system type of financing option. And the goal for Bushel has been, since we're sitting at that middle where those two interactions and transactions actually meet, to make and surface those options much easier. So imagine being able to see that fertilizer bill and you're about to pay it, but you've decided you may want to finance it, and now you can choose that financing option and
Nice.
get moving. And so that's the kind of interaction we're trying to solve for and make it really easy for them to interact, whether it's with their bank or their farm credit or whoever else they might work with.
Sounds fantastic. Now I understand why you've got so many farmers in the U.S. Well, they're co-ops, let's say, that service these farmers signing up, because it is making a process that seems to be a huge headache and very traditional. And Trevor, you were talking about these are groups of people that don't always like change, but you're giving them the tools to be able to do that change and take it on board in a much more seamless way. Trevor, what, in addition to things that you've seen like Bushel digitizing this process, what are the other areas that you think are really hot in terms of agri-tech and the cross section, maybe between agri and fintech?
Yeah, I think Jake just spoke to it mostly, where these data play technologies that can offer a fintech solution in the near term can ramp up to provide more services, more value. They may extend to risk mitigation tools, for instance, insurance, as Jake was just covering, but that list can grow. For us, we have the ambition to see those same technologies offer a through line of transparency to the consumer. So, can the work Jake's doing at the elevator someday translate to a stronger value add at the consumer point? And I think the more mature companies, again, are thinking about that right now. So we're really excited for those type of technologies that don't only have a data capture, but they're aggregating and making composite data models to provide a more thorough lens of transparency from end to end.
And when you say for the consumer, do you mean like I just went to my greengrocer before this, and I purchased grapefruit and some different things like that. Does it mean transparency of where that's coming from, or do you mean other kind of transparency?
Yeah, I think loosely that's kind of what I'm referring to. And Jake may not be looking for that specifically, but other technologies that we see as leaders in the field that are also kind of leading, going to market with a data play where they're aggregating, potentially going to a beachhead that includes fintech, for instance. They're trying to extrapolate. Okay, we're collecting information on field and in-field sensing technology, for instance. The farmer, there's an extra cost associated with that. How do we represent not only that cost, but also the added nutrient composition and the added value to the end consumer that somehow gets lost? So by having a straight line of that information ultimately will provide the consumer with more provenance, understanding, and hopefully a better sense of why their food may cost a little extra, because they're getting a much higher quality product.
That's very interesting. I don't know if you have this in the States, but here in the Netherlands, we have also ratings at one of the biggest grocery stores, Albert Heijn. They'll give an A to E rating, A being, this is very good quality, good nutrients, and E less so. And even on juices, I've seen them give E, and I guess that's they put too much sugar in the juice or who knows what.
Yeah.
Do we have that kind of thing in the US where they help us determine, this food quality aspect?
I can go from my lens on the downstream side, and maybe Jake can offer more of an upstream answer there. But I think that we've seen different tests and prototypes that involve dynamic pricing for nutrient quality, et cetera. It's very speculative. So I say the short answer is no. But that's not to say that there isn't a consumer demand for that. So that's kind of the other side of what I'm describing. That ultimate end-to-end sort of goal that we were heading towards. Like, there are teams and consumer companies trying to solve for that, but they don't have the connectivity upstream.
Exactly.
So, this is a challenge on both ends. There's not really a good connection point. But Jake, do you see it differently from your point of view?
I'd say the answer is no today, and part of it is because the idea of tracing a kernel of corn or some sort of very detailed level traceability doesn't really exist in large scale agriculture today in the US. And so that's part of the challenge. And then additionally, we're probably more focused on how do we just get a sense of the carbon intensity that we're creating in agriculture, more so than maybe worrying about the ingredients itself at this point. I think there's a bigger challenge that is being pressured on this space to work on sustainability and how do we lower our CI scores when we're producing ethanol, for example, or some form of fuel like that. There's a significant push here in the US to figure that out maybe first, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. And I'm not sure if my next question is going to make sense, but I hope so. So one of the startups that we had worked with in the past, and they've also been on this FinTech for Good Way, they're based in Colombia, and they started with working with the largest restaurant chain there and helping them look at how sustainable their supply chain was. And from there, they went back to, okay, these cooperatives are selling to this restaurant chain, and so we can help their farmers finance things, right? So they added the fintech component, let's say, after the sustainability one. Do you see some of the big, restaurant chains or uptakers in the US looking to want to understand how sustainable their supply chain is? And this goes to your point about, the CO2 levels of emission and things like this.
Trevor, I think
Yeah.
Major, not restaurant chains, but like Walmart and such, are very serious about this right now, trying to figure out how do they source appropriately. And maybe you could speak to your customers that probably are in that space.
Yeah, so I don't know if this is a top-down approach or I think that's maybe how I would think of it. either way, there's fracture in the line, right? I think there's a demand on those from those larger consumer facing companies, whether they're restaurants or retailers like Walmart. And there's a lot of energy and resources being devoted to understanding point of origin, provenance. Um, it and I guess it's a debate whether you want to start from the bottom up. Not to say farms are at the bottom, but they're certainly the point of origin. It's a challenge, and I think that the fracture will be solved for by viable um, data plays again that can not only provide solutions for users in real time, but also provide clean data to those large clients, the corporations that ultimately are going to be plugging them into their legacy ERP systems. They need to make sense of that, aggregate onboard tools that can help that data be more precise and learn, for instance. Um, I think these are all things that Bushel has in scope somewhere, and certainly has solutions for it in different ways. But yeah, we think that there is a big opportunity here.
Elizabeth, when it comes to financing, I think it's important on this space as well. One of the challenges is to incentivize or convince the farm to change practice or to do things differently. And so there's a lot of conversations happening amongst some of our customers about a financing partner to help make that transition make sense. So you may sign up for a program that's going to pay you for lowering a CI score or changing practice, but the payout may not be able to happen for a year or two till after it happens, but it costs you money to make that transition. And so the idea of financing that bridge is a significant opportunity, I think, as well, that a lot of customers of ours are looking at.
Nice. And you think that, like, as of 2025, you might be able to help them in some regard with that?
Yeah, well, so our goal has been to surface the most obvious programs, whether it's third parties or our own customers' programs, and get them in front of the farmers that make sense. And one of the challenges is reaching the right farmers. So you might have a reach of 100,000 farmers, but not every farmer has an opportunity to change practice and do the program you might be looking for. And so some of our data sets can help our customers and their partners identify what section of their farm, customer base would actually fit a program, and then a more direct reach out rather than a broad based advertisement or phone calls to everybody. You can go directly to that farmer and say, hey, we know that if you were to change this practice next year, you could participate in this program. Would you like to be part of it? That's
amazing. And the data that you're already collecting would enable you to be able to reach out to the right ones at the right time.
Yep. Everything from the crop they're growing to maybe practices based on what they're telling us in our Bushel Farm tool, to the types of products that they're buying from their co-op that might qualify them or not for something. So I think it's kind of all of the above that can be part of this.
Very cool. So Trevor, you have been working with Bushel for how long now?
But since I joined the bank, but I think that the relationship predates that. So potentially around 2017, I think, maybe even earlier, quite a while.
Yeah, that's right. And I was one of the FoodBytes awardees along the way, and so a big fan of the program.
This is great. How many startups are highlighted on FoodBytes, and can you tell also a little bit more about what FoodBytes does, if there are investors out there that are interested in this area and don't know, maybe want to come see it?
Yeah, so foodbytesworld.com is where we're sort of hosting a hub for startups like Bushel, but also even earlier stage companies that want to get exposure to a network of around 1,500 corporate and investor daily users, and then around 2,000 fellow startups. So it's a true database, but there's more interaction across those stakeholders. That's one big part of what we do. Jake joined the program at a time where we had a different approach, and it was smaller in nature. It was more cohort based. But I think the desire to help companies scale and find the companies that are going to be adding the most meaningful value to our clients remains a big driver for us, and it remains a big part of my job. So if you're a startup, you're looking to join that, certainly contact me, but create a profile as well, and you can interact with those investor and corporate users.
as someone who's benefited from the process, I think if I'm a startup today, I'm in the agriculture space or more broadly the food space, I would say this is one of the best networks you can get plugged into. And so I would encourage anybody who's kind of listening in on that to consider what Trevor's team's doing. I think it's been incredible for Bushel.
That's great to know. That's really, really nice. So any things, before we sign off that maybe we haven't mentioned? Are there, Trevor, Jake, any hot technologies coming out that you think are really interesting, that people should be aware of, or startups that you think that, yeah, this is very exciting?
I think without naming names, I think I'm excited just around maturation broadly written and the way that these technologies can compound and add value to their own growth stories. So I think we covered that quite well here today. We could go on into different subsectors. I think as it relates to more or less fintech and the sort of near term adjacent technologies that cover data, that's what I'm really excited about.
Very nice. Thank you. Jake, anything you wanted to add?
Well, I think in the next couple years, you're going to see a significant transition, at least for agriculture, when it comes to digitization of not just some of the tools. I would argue that farmers are the last part. They're not the problem right now in adoption of technology. I think the middle of the supply chain is challenged with the biggest hurdles, and they're starting to move and adopt these tools. And it's really exciting. We do some surveys every year, the State of the Farm survey from Bushel. And one of the things we ask is, do you use Venmo or PayPal or one of these technologies in your personal life?
Cool. Yeah.
And the answer there is, 80% of people are doing that. Farmers are doing that. And yet in their farm life, they're writing paper checks still. And so we know the transition is just around the corner. And I think part of the challenge has been who's going to build some of those tools. Bushel's building some of them, but there's a lot of other parties out there that are working on practical tools that farmers can be excited about using. And it brings you closer to the relationships that matter for your company and your finances. So I'm excited to see that happen the next couple of years.
Well, I'm excited to see that happen too. I tell you, 20 years ago, when I would tell my colleagues over here, yeah, we're still writing checks in the States, they thought I was out of my mind. But yeah, still happens. There was one other question I wanted to ask. It's about insurance. Going back to insurance, are y'all also thinking of in the future offering some? These are some insurances that you might want to think about if you don't have it already, or is that something not on the roadmap? I don't know.
It's a good question. In U.S. agriculture, there's kind of a top 20 set of companies who offer crop insurance. The interesting thing about that is crop insurance is the price that it is. There's no price negotiation. There's no way to offer a better version per se of traditional crop insurance. So then there's the question of the alternatives. And I think Bushel's path has always been, we're a software player. We don't actually underwrite loans, so therefore we probably won't underwrite insurance, but we might make it easier for them to interact. And so we have some insurance partners, some of the larger companies here in the U.S. that do crop insurance work with our tools. And so a farmer can actually connect their account to their insurance agent, and then agent can self-serve for the farmer and help them work through a claim. So there are some things we're doing there, but I think offering it has been tried, and it's challenging. It's a very relationship-driven game. I think many farmers choose their insurance based on which cousin or friend of theirs is offering it. And so that's an interesting challenge when it comes to technology.
Well, thank you both. It's really been fascinating to hear about the journey, and it's, different in the States than in other places. But I love what FoodBytes is doing and how Rabobank is really supporting the ecosystem. And I love to see how you're supporting those farmers. So thank y'all both for taking the time to be with us today.
Oh, thank you, Liz. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Breaking Banks Europe, a Provoke Media podcast in cooperation with FinTech Stage. Don't forget to tweet us out, shout out, or post to the team at Breaking Banks EU on Twitter. If there's something or someone you'd like to hear on our cast, let us know. See you next week on Breaking Banks Europe.